Hello, welcome to the channel Wise Stories. Enjoy watching.
The large cottage settlement was visible from afar, beautifully outlined against the backdrop of the evergreen forest with its perpetual shade of blue. The pines standing there were quite a distance away, but it was thanks to them that the air here was so refreshing. Additionally, each cottage here was worth a small fortune because of them. Year after year, a close-knit community of affluent settlers formed here. In one of the picturesque corners of the rural area, there was a splendid glass greenhouse surrounded by a lush, blooming garden. It was built with love and care, and every detail was meticulously planned. This greenhouse was not just a place for growing vegetables and fruits. It was meant to be an orangery where one could enjoy the beauty and aroma of flowers, as well as spend time reading books and contemplating nature. The greenhouse was nearly complete, with only a few minor details left to finish. Its transparent walls were framed with elegant metal frames, and the roof was made of a sturdy yet lightweight material that let the sunlight in while protecting the interior from rain and wind. Roberto straightened up, wiping his forehead with his hand. He had built this greenhouse himself and now admired his creation. His mother, who had just come out of the estate, now stood beside him, her hands on her hips. "It's so beautiful," Eulalia said with an undisguised smile. Inside the greenhouse, pots of various plants were neatly arranged, filling the air with their unique fragrance. Among them were roses, lilies, orchids, and many other flowers that delighted the eye. The elderly woman was standing there, looking at them, proud and in awe of her son's work. She knew that he had poured all his love and care into this project, and now the greenhouse would not only be a place to enjoy nature, but also a source of inspiration and joy for her. "It's almost done. You just need to lay the pathway to the main one, and that's it. The greenhouse itself is ready," Roberto said. "Wow, it's beautiful. I almost feel bad for asking you to do it. There were so many options, I could have hired builders," she said awkwardly. "Oh, Mom, stop it. I was genuinely interested in building it myself. Did I become an architect for nothing?" Roberto replied with a smirk. He straightened up and scratched his head. His old jeans looked worn but still sturdy. Eulalia walked past her son and peered into the greenhouse. She smiled, already imagining how she would spend her time there. She knew that in this greenhouse, she could spend long hours enjoying the beauty and scents of the flowers, tending to the plants, and reading her favorite books. She envisioned herself sitting on a cozy bench, gazing at the clouds drifting across the sky, and listening to the songs of the birds in the garden. At that moment, she realized that the greenhouse had become not just a structure for growing plants, but also a symbol of her love for nature, beauty, and life. Every time she stepped inside, her heart filled with joy and gratitude for all the wonderful moments she had been able to spend in this magical place. Eulalia tiptoed and planted a kiss on her son's cheek. She smiled. It wouldn't be enough for her to say that she was just grateful. It was her true dream to have a greenhouse, an orangery, where she even planned to have butterflies. 1,000 ideas flooded her mind at once. She even felt the urge to set up an easel and start painting like she had done 20 years ago. Mother and son headed towards the house. Roberto was tired but content. Several times, he looked back at the magnificent orangery, and a satisfied smile unconsciously appeared on his face. "Dad passed away, and soon you'll leave the family," the elderly woman said. "Mom, don't start. Everything will be fine. So, I'm getting married. What's going to change? Or do you want me to never get married and stay with you forever?" "Oh, no, my dear. I'm not talking about that at all. We all grow up, and we all need our own families. Come on, go inside," she said. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled. Eulalia raised her eyes. Dark clouds loomed in the distance. Lightning flashed, and rain started again. It had been raining heavily this season. She feared that the roses her late husband had planted many years ago might suffer from such a deluge. During the night, rain had fallen. Roberto, who woke up later than his mother, opened the windows of his bedroom. The air outside carried a wonderful scent that often envelopes the countryside after rain. It smelled of grass, with a pleasant, fresh note, and it also had a hint of pine. All these scents were intertwined. Roberto took a deep breath, leaned over the windowsill, and once again gazed at the greenhouse. It was time to head back home. He changed, packed his things, and descended the stairs to the kitchen. The interior of this room was adorned in lavender tones, creating an atmosphere of coziness and warmth. All the furniture and decor were carefully selected, forming a harmonious ensemble. The kitchen was furnished with expensive yet comfortable natural materials. In the center of the room, there was a large and stylish light-toned kitchen set that perfectly complemented the overall design of the space. The kitchen always exuded order and cleanliness, thanks to the efforts of the homeowner's mother, who was currently preparing breakfast. A large skillet with an omelet was on the stove, and fresh fruits and vegetables were neatly arranged nearby, enticing with their bright and juicy appearance. The adult son, ready to go home, was sitting at the table, sipping his coffee and savoring the last moments of being in his childhood home. He was watching his mother work with pleasure, silently acknowledging her skill in creating a comfortable and warm atmosphere in the house. "When will you introduce us? What's her name? Claudia?" he asked his mother. "Christina." "Why, Mom? You seem to have this fixed idea that all women just want money from me, so I wouldn't be surprised if you don't like her at all. And besides, I'm not sure if it's worth it," the man said. "What are you saying?" his mother exclaimed, placing her hands on her hips. "You're getting married, and you don't even know when you'll introduce her to your mother. Well, that can't go on like this, my boy. We're family, you and I. We're the only family we have. So don't make a fuss, bring her over next weekend, and we'll get to know her. On the condition that you won't make a scene, and I know you." At first, you smiled at their faces and then made a scene, the son replied with a smirk. He already knew that his mother wouldn't keep her promise. Eulalia was a kind woman, but she loved her son very much. She genuinely feared that every girl he met was only after his money. She made a meal for her son, had coffee with him, and then walked him to his car. Roberto got into his blue car, and soon he was gone. Eulalia, standing by the grand estate, could only manage a sad smile and return to the house, where she would once again be alone. On both sides of the road, there were various trees, some tall and straight, others short and crooked. It felt like anyone had planted trees along this road as they pleased. Roberto knew this road by heart. He also knew that he would still have to introduce his fiancée to his mother. He was already preparing for it, but he didn't know how to prepare his fiancée for it. Even when Roberto arrived home, his mind was still preoccupied. He felt like a hostage to the situation. "Next weekend, we're going to the cottage settlement," he said. "I'll introduce you to my mother." Christina, who was setting the table at that moment, stared at her beloved. She didn't expect such a proposal from him. Furthermore, they had agreed to get married without all these formalities. "Wait, didn't you just say?" Christina began, but he interrupted her. "I don't have dementia or amnesia. I know what I said and what I meant. It's just that the situation has changed. I talked to my mother. She's still my mother, of course. You just don't need to take it too personally," Roberto explained vaguely. Christina sighed and raised her hands in exasperation. She took off her apron and hung it on a hook. She sat at the table. Her mood was spoiled. Roberto had presented her with a fait accompli. She couldn't stand it when he was so blunt with her. Christina was sitting there, looking out the window, utterly disappointed, with a sad expression. The light rain was tapping on the glass, leaving long, pale trails. Why now? Why at this moment when she already had so many problems? "Christina, come on. We're going to be husband and wife. We'll have to introduce her sooner or later. Besides, I want to move out of the rented apartment and live at my parents' house. It's a big estate with a garden, and I even built a greenhouse there. I wanted to get a dog. And if we have a child, Can you imagine how great it would be to grow up there? There's even a pond on the estate. I grew up in that house myself, and our child will grow up there too, Roberto persisted. What if my mother doesn't like me? What if she causes a scene? Christina asked, her voice trembling with fear. If she doesn't like you, she'll have to come to terms with it. This introduction, regardless of the outcome, won't affect our relationship, okay? I want you to understand me correctly. I need to respect my mother, and you'll have to find a way to get along somehow. I don't intend to spend half my life living in a rented apartment when I have my own estate, Roberto said in an irritated tone. He realized that he had been too harsh and had frightened her with his loud tone. She was so gentle and so vulnerable, and that's what he loved about her. Roberto pulled a chair, along with Christina sitting on it, closer to him. He held her close, and she buried her head in his shoulder. You'll have to meet her, whether you like it or not. Please be a mature woman for just a few days. Keep your tongue in check, be more modest and calm. Let her say what she wants. It won't affect my feelings for you, Roberto said. He released her from the embrace. When Christina had finished setting the table and they sat down to dinner, her mood didn't improve. Even after a glass of wine, Christina couldn't calm down. Every day that stretched out like chewing gum now seemed tiresome to her. When the evening of their departure arrived, her mood plummeted further. She packed a small suitcase for herself and another for her future husband. Roberto carried them to the car. All that remained was to spend the night in the apartment, and tomorrow morning they would hit the road. Christina woke up as she heard her husband's irritated voice. She could hear him arguing with someone, but she couldn't make out the words. It felt as though the conversation was happening in a dream. However, when Christina fully woke up, her husband's voice became clearer. And what are you suggesting now? No, Teodoro, that's not the way out. Where are we supposed to find a new restaurant now? You're so interesting, I swear. And after this, you want to call yourself my friend? Roberto yelled. He was standing on the balcony, apparently to avoid waking his future wife, but it didn't work. He yelled so loudly that everything could be heard. Roberto turned around abruptly just as Christina got out of bed. His appearance was frightening, his dark hair was disheveled, and his face was red with anger. It was a bad sign. Christina went to the kitchen, brewed coffee, and when her future husband came in, she placed a cup in front of him. It's over with the restaurant. We have to find a new place from scratch. Where will we find a new restaurant in a month? Trader. You see, he has a bigger client. And what am I, a small client? The man ranted. Christina tried not to interfere. The less she inserted herself when he was in a terrible mood, the less likely they were to have an argument. By the time they had reached the car, Roberto had thawed a bit. However, his mood was still far from good. Christina believed that it was a bad omen to start a trip in such a terrible state. The young groom was sitting behind the wheel of his car, nervously glancing at his watch. His bride was in the passenger seat, trying to calm him down, gently stroking his shoulder. The radio was softly humming in the background, providing some distraction from their thoughts. The young couple was riding in silence, listening to the music, each lost in their own thoughts. It was early morning outside, and the wide, empty road was shrouded in thick fog. The fog slowly dissipated, revealing picturesque landscapes of the surrounding nature. Soon, a cottage settlement came into view in the distance. The young couple sighed with relief as they gazed at the beautiful houses enveloped in greenery and flowers. Don't worry too much. My mother is kind, she just loves me very much. Besides, you know, when you have so much money, it always feels like everyone is after it. Well, it's probably time for us to go, he said. The man turned his head towards the estate. The woman had already stepped onto the porch. Even from this distance, he could see that his mother wasn't smiling. It was terrifying to imagine what would happen next. He tried to find the right words in his head to comfort Christina, but he already knew that a scene was inevitable. His mother could promise anything, but he knew her too well. Christina also got out of the car, But unlike the woman, her smile was genuine. She felt a knot in her stomach from fear. It felt like she wanted to run away. Christina quickly glanced at Roberto. He nodded and reassuringly took her hand. "Hello, dears. My name is Eulalia. Shall we stand here on the doorstep?" "Come in, there's no need for formality," the woman proudly declared, gesturing towards the estate. Her whole life, she had been proud of her father's estate and always believed that her children would live here after her. In her mind, there were often idealistic images, like something out of a pastoral scene, her eldest daughter sitting on the veranda, taking care of her child, and her son and his young wife strolling through the garden. She was standing in the kitchen, cooking without servants, imagining them all gathering around the dinner table. The magnificent estate was nestled amidst dense trees and lush bushes. It was a true architectural masterpiece that seamlessly blended with the surrounding landscape. Beautiful white columns and graceful arches gave the building an airiness and lightness. Neat cobblestone paths led to various recreational areas around the estate. The park featured a beautiful garden with a variety of flowers and trees. The bushes were trimmed into animal shapes, creating an atmosphere of fairy tales and magic. Next to the garden was a pond where golden fish and swans were swimming. The pond was surrounded by an elegant gazebo where guests could enjoy the serenity and beauty of nature. Inside the gazebo, there was a small table where one could have a cup of coffee, savoring the tranquility. Every detail was carefully thought out and harmoniously integrated with the rest. It was a place where you could escape the hustle and bustle of the city, enjoy the beauty of nature, and feel like a true nobleman. The girl was staring almost open-mouthed at all of this. She knew that Roberto was well off, but she had no idea it was to this extent. Eulalia was the first to enter the house. She immediately turned to the right, bypassing the massive living room, and entered the dining room. Despite the somewhat decadent exterior of the building, the interior was all modern. This created a minor dissonance, but it only lasted for the first few seconds. "So, tell me about yourself," the woman said. "What do you do for a living? Where are you studying? What are your plans for life? Or is your only plan to marry a wealthy guy?" "Mom!" Roberto barked sharply. His mother pursed her lips, and Christina decided to pretend like nothing had happened. "I'm a student. I want to work remotely in the future. I've chosen an interesting profession, interior design. I absolutely love it. Sometimes it feels like I've picked my dream job right off the bat," Christina said joyfully. "Well, I suppose you expect Roberto to invest in your own agency, don't you?" the mother asked. "I don't need an agency. I'll be working for myself," she replied, shaking her head. "Yeah, right. You want to turn me into a fool. It's obvious you have nothing. You came from the countryside, and everything was ready-made for you. You found yourself a little naive guy. He's just a regular guy, and you think you can easily fool him. And you all hang on him, thinking that I'll let this happen," the woman exclaimed. "Christina, go back to the car," Roberto said calmly, wiping his face with a napkin. To avoid escalating the situation, Christina stood up and left the table. She turned away quickly to hide the tears welling up in her eyes. Roberto remained alone with his mother. He knew she would start her rant, but he didn't expect her to refuse to serve food after their long journey. Even a snake doesn't attack when a beast drinks or eats. "We've had our share of problems. The restaurant was canceled. She's already worried, and now you are." "Well, thanks, Mom, for your hospitality and generosity," Roberto said, standing up from the table. "What's gotten into you? Are there no other girls? If you choose someone of your own rating, then I won't have to worry." "They're all after you for your money, and you're so naive," the elderly woman said. She grabbed her son's hand but couldn't hold onto him. He quickly walked towards the exit. The elderly woman followed him. When he stepped outside, she did too, but at a slower pace. Roberto stopped, turned around, and looked at his mother. Disappointment was clearly visible in his eyes. "I love her. I've never loved anyone like this before. I've told you myself that I'd never get married and that there's no woman for whom I'd put on a ring. But I proposed to her because I wanted her to be my wife. I love her, and I want to take responsibility for her. If you can't accept that, it's not my fault, he said firmly. Roberto left the estate and got into the car. Christina was sitting with her head hanging low, shedding tears onto her lap. At first, he remained silent, giving her the space to process what had just happened. He, too, felt upset about his mother's behavior. I'm not after your money. I'm willing to sign any prenuptial agreement you suggest, she said. Come on, don't even think about that, he replied. I don't suspect you of anything. I know you too well, Christina. My mother, well, tends to exaggerate. They didn't discuss it any further. The radio played quietly during the entire drive. Sometimes, Christina thought that commercials seemed to be more frequent than the actual music or the announcers' voices. The young bride and groom arrived at their apartment, both feeling rather down. They didn't want to talk to each other initially, but as soon as they crossed the threshold of their home, their moods began to change. Fatigue from the long journey began to catch up with them, and they, forgetting their differences, began to settle in. The apartment was spacious and bright, with large windows overlooking a green courtyard. After a while, they found themselves sitting on the couch, tired but content, admiring the results of their work. As they engaged in conversation, they remembered what had caused their argument and decided to put it behind them, realizing that it was only a temporary misunderstanding. However, the mother's words hung over them like an unspoken veil, creating a strange atmosphere. Roberto wasn't particularly fond of this apartment himself. He had rented it only to live together with Christina. Even though they were supposed to leave for a few days, they returned on the same day. But, for some reason, this apartment seemed incredibly cozy and simple to him. He was ashamed of his girlfriend because of his mother's behavior. However, on the other hand, he understood his mother's perspective. Don't even think about prenuptial agreements. Everything will be fine. I know that we're together for a reason. I didn't propose to you for no reason. If I saw that you were only after money, it wouldn't have happened. It's just that my mother doesn't understand how difficult it is for me to face her misunderstanding every time, he said. It can't go on like this forever, Christina replied. I know. I think once we get married, she might calm down a bit. Maybe she'll pull herself together, and you'll start getting along. My mother is actually a very good person, you know. She organizes charity events, helps others, and does a lot for our foundation. And if she didn't behave like that, you'd actually really like her, Roberto said with a smile. But Christina had doubts about that. She just nodded to avoid stirring the conversation further. Roberto himself realized that she didn't take his words very seriously. Taking a deep breath, he decided to change the subject. Now, they talked frequently about his work and how he wanted to try a different field. He shared various childhood stories, constantly emphasizing that his mother wasn't a bad person. Christina fell asleep that evening, but Roberto couldn't. He was sitting on the balcony, gazing at the nighttime city surrounded by warm, cozy lights, contemplating whether they could establish a balance in their relationship with his mother. A spacious piece of land, surrounded by a lush garden, was home to a large glass-enclosed veranda. The veranda's walls were completely covered with green plants, creating the atmosphere of a tropical forest. In the center of the veranda, there was a wicker table around which comfortable chairs were arranged. The elderly hostess of the veranda, dressed in a long floral-printed dress, was sitting at the table. Next to her, on a chair, sat a neighbor whom she had invited for coffee. On the table was a porcelain tea set with aromatic coffee, honey, and dried fruits. The air on the veranda was filled with the scents of flowers and herbs, combined with the aroma of coffee and honey. The hostess and her guest engaged in a leisurely conversation about life, the weather, and global events. Their voices were soft and soothing, creating an overall mood of calm and harmony. The veranda was filled with light and warmth, as if inviting guests to immerse themselves in an atmosphere of comfort and hospitality. It felt so good there that one would want to stay forever, forgetting about all the cares and troubles of the outside world. I still remember when your husband built this veranda. I remember how happy you were. You were pregnant with Roberto, right? The neighbor asked. Maria took a sip of the delicious coffee, closed her eyes in pleasure, leaned back in the wicker chair, and a contented smile appeared on her face. Yes. Can you imagine how many years have passed? And why do they grow up so quickly? When he was little, it was so hard for me. I prayed for that time to pass quickly. But now, I would give anything to go back to the moment when he was just a funny little kid, Eulalia said. And your little kid will soon have his own little kids, Maria said, laughing. Didn't you like your daughter-in-law? She's nothing. Just an ordinary country girl, nothing special. She came to the city to marry a city guy, and she ended up with a rich one. I wonder how fate helped her. Only for what merits? I don't need that kind of wedding, and I don't need that kind of daughter-in-law, Eulalia retorted sharply. Maria chuckled at Eulalia's reaction. She clearly couldn't understand her lively response. When she looked at her friend, Maria burst into laughter again, revealing her good mood. Well, are you out of your mind, Eulalia? Shall I remind you of how you brought your husband home? Or perhaps you'd like me to remind you how his mother used to come in hysterics, saying you weren't suitable for him. Don't tell me you've forgotten how hard it was or how you cried on the porch because his family didn't accept you? Maria said. At that moment, Eulalia was struck as if by thunder. She was sitting there, while her gaze was shifting from one flower pot to another. She had indeed completely forgotten that she had been in a similar situation. Maria smirked once more. It's your son, Eulalia. He's already a grown man. Let him make his own mistakes, Maria said. Eulalia hung her head low. She was watching as the coffee was glistening like amber under the sunlight. She felt terribly ashamed of her behavior. She remembered how difficult and frightening it had been during those moments. Why had she treated that girl that way? Why hadn't she broken that vicious cycle? But as soon as Eulalia imagined having to apologize, everything inside her turned upside down. Maria took her friend's hand. Now both their hands rested on the beautifully woven table. Eulalia, call your son and talk to him. You understand that it's inevitable. Look, you have two options: make amends with your son, help him with the restaurant, and establish your relationship with him. Or you have another option: stay at your estate, take offense, and hold grudges. Who will benefit from that? So, think about whether you're doing the right thing, Maria said. She withdrew her hand and then directed her gaze into the courtyard. She saw a large and beautiful conservatory that Roberto had built. In the background, there was a pristine white gazebo that would soon be too chilly to sit in. Somewhere in the distance, there was a garden with fruit trees. At times, it seemed to her that she loved the estate's courtyard and exterior more than her own. Our children are growing up, Eulalia. It's time to stop sheltering them. They need to make their own mistakes and decisions. You do understand that sooner or later, he'll get married anyway. Maybe this country girl isn't as bad of a choice as you think. Besides, he should choose his own wife, right? If it turns out badly, well, he can get a divorce. Who hasn't been through that? But what if he doesn't divorce and loves her for the rest of his days? Think about it. Are you going to spend your whole life undermining them? Don't turn into the mother-in-law who genuinely gets on everyone's nerves, Maria said. Eulalia nodded, but her thoughts were still in turmoil. She was willing to call her son, but now she would have to find a way to apologize to him. She needed a reason to call him and initiate a conversation. Maybe it would work out for her. In the meantime, Eulalia stared into space. Her thoughts were constantly wandering. Sometimes she thought about creating a separate relaxation area, and other times she imagined the words she would use to apologize to her son. Did she really have to backtrack? She couldn't stand apologizing, and admitting her mistake was even more unbearable. But here, she would have to do both. Eulalia looked at Maria with a weary smile. Her friend nodded meaningfully, indicating that she understood the serious conversation that lay ahead. He's your son. You no longer have a daughter, Eulalia. May the Lord rest her soul. She was a wonderful woman. You have only one son left. Are you really going to sacrifice your relationship with him just to prove your point? Once he makes a mistake, you can tell him, I told you so. But for now, pull yourself together and stop being an old woman who does nothing but grumble and scare off her own family, Maria insisted. When Maria left, Eulalia was still sitting on the veranda. She sipped her coffee, occasionally leaning towards the thermos. On evenings like this, as the temperature slowly dropped, she longed for warmth and coziness. But no comfort was possible when the vast house was utterly empty. A black cat approached, jumped onto her lap, and purred like a locomotive. Eulalia stroked the cat and thought about calling her son tomorrow, even if he didn't want to talk to her. The next morning, Eulalia held the phone in her hand but couldn't make the call. She turned it over in her hand and then simply set it aside. Eulalia went about her usual tasks, preparing breakfast, tending to the greenhouse, and then visiting the conservatory. She noted all the flower names and went to a large garden store for new equipment. She brought back several plants and even a pine tree she was planning to plant. But the longer she delayed the call, the more she felt her anxiety building. Yes, hello, her son answered. Roberto, please don't hang up. I really want to apologize. I'm a terrible person. I promised you one thing and then caused a scene. I behaved rudely, and it's unforgivable. I spent so much time preparing, and I didn't even offer you any food when you arrived. I'm so sorry, my son, she said. She was hoping that her son would immediately tell her that everything was fine. However, Roberto remained silent. There were voices in the background. Then someone slammed a door, and the conversation grew much quieter. Taking a deep breath, Eulalia decided to reveal her second secret ingredient in the conversation. I've been thinking that I'll make amends with your fiancée myself, and you can tell her you don't need a restaurant. Today, I saw something so interesting. Let's set up a huge tent on our property. We'll make it beautiful and romantic, with greenery everywhere. You know, like in that movie about the wizard boy? They had a wedding in a tent, but we'll do it in a modern way. I'll handle all the catering, I'll find good people. The waitstaff will run around like crazy. You won't need a restaurant, and there won't be any worry if some of the guests have too much to drink. Think about it, my son, she said. It's a good idea, Mom. We should seriously consider it. Well, I have to get back to work. I appreciate that you overcame yourself and called. I know how difficult it was for you to make that call. I genuinely appreciate your suggestion, he said. Your father's mother didn't accept me either, but I completely forgot about it. I'll be honest with you, I still don't trust her. But I'll keep myself in check this time, for sure. It's important to me that you stay on this estate. Our family needs to continue living here. You need to come over, and we'll all live together until the wedding. We'll work on the menu with your fiancé and figure out how to welcome the guests. My goodness, I can even organize horses and a carriage, if you remember Laura. She can make her a dress in no time. One that no one else will have, she said. Eulalia was trying to seize any opportunity to show her son how guilty she felt. Biting her lip, she showed her full hand. When Roberto hung up, he was in a troubled state of mind. On the one hand, it was nice that his mother had apologized and finally found the strength to admit her mistake. On the other hand, after everything that had happened, Roberto couldn't even imagine how they would all live in the same house. Roberto, come on, people are waiting, Eleonora said, peering into the hallway. Roberto straightened his jacket and entered the conference room where his conference was taking place. After the conference, his thoughts returned to his mother. He was already picturing beautiful scenes in his head of how they would celebrate the wedding in the tent. And it really would be very romantic, stylish, and beautiful. Such a celebration would be much more memorable than the notorious restaurants. Roberto drove home, replaying his mother's words in his head. The city was congested with cars. Roberto had to constantly detour through courtyards to avoid the traffic. It would have been easier to just exit the city from another side and head to the cottage community without all these traffic jams and the sea of vehicles. And when winter came, it would be even harder to drive around the city. Now he needed to find the right words to make amends with Christina. The incident deeply affected her, and it was unlikely she would eagerly return to the mansion. He suggested meeting at a cafe to talk on neutral ground. It would be better for both of them. In the heart of the city, near a picturesque pond in the park, there was a cozy urban cafe. Its interior was done in an eco-style, giving the place a special charm and coziness. Everything was made from natural wood, walls, floors, and furniture. White lace adorned the pristine tablecloths, adding notes of tenderness and romance to the overall interior. The cafe attracted a diverse crowd of visitors, from young couples and families with children to groups of friends and solitary dreamers. Everyone found something of their own that made them happy and filled their lives with new colors. The cafe operated around the clock, so there was always a spot to relax and unwind. Soft music was playing in the background, creating a cozy atmosphere. Visitors could enjoy views of the pond and the park while sitting at an outdoor table. The cafe staff was welcoming and attentive, always ready to assist with menu choices. The menu was diverse, featuring European cuisine, desserts, and beverages, all with an emphasis on the quality and freshness of the ingredients. By the time Roberto walked into the cafe, Christina was already seated at a table, holding the menu with both hands. She was studying the options, looking for something suitable. Just as the waiter approached, Roberto ordered without needing to look at the menu. They had been here many times, and he usually ordered the same thing. "Roberto, do you think we'll still go to Italy, as we planned, after the wedding? I found this interesting place there." "They say," Christina began, but as soon as she lifted her eyes to her groom, she fell silent. "Christina, my mother called. She suggested celebrating the wedding in a tent. Not like the gypsies in old movies, but in a beautiful modern tent. We'll create a cool, atmospheric wedding in a rustic style. She's genuinely sorry." She stumbles over her words, almost in tears all the time. She wants to make amends. "Besides, you know that people of her age can say far worse things," Roberto said. In that moment, Christina realized that Roberto had already made up his mind. He wouldn't listen to her arguments. He was more likely to agree with his mother. It hurt her because he had intended to marry Christina, and her opinion should have been the most important. On the other hand, Roberto's mother was right. A wedding in a large tent would be memorable. Moreover, they hadn't found another restaurant yet. There was too little time to rent a venue for the celebration. Christina was listening to him, but she had no thoughts at all. She felt hurt. Moreover, Christina felt that she would have to make amends with Eulalia one way or another. The waiter placed 2 large dishes on the table and then brought 2 coffee cups. He double-checked a few details about the order and then walked away. Christina calmly enjoyed her salad, gazing at the pond. Several ducks were already hurrying towards an old man who was sitting on a bench, holding a bag. Soon, breadcrumbs were floating on the water. "Surely you want us to move," Christina said indifferently. "This is my family's nest. Of course, I want to live there and don't want my mother to be alone in her old age. You know, when my father passed away and then my sister, my mother was barely holding on. I don't want her to be alone. Besides, we won't be bothering anyone there." "It's not like living in the tiny cottage," Roberto said. Again, he spoke with authority. He had already made up his mind and didn't want to involve himself in her reasoning and arguments. Christina nodded as if it would help. She remained silent, gazing out of the window. Roberto knew exactly what she was thinking, but he had genuinely made up his mind, and he didn't want his decisions to be in vain. The car slowly approached a massive cemetery. Even from here, one could see that a part of it was entirely occupied by mausoleums. Trees that hung down as if morning often cast long shadows, adding a more eerie look to the place, even now in the morning fog. Eulalia stopped the car, got out, and stood there for a few seconds. Right in front of her were ornate wrought iron gates with black crows and grapevines sculpted by a blacksmith and enormous embossed leaves. And why the crows and grapes of all things? Eulalia asked herself this question every time she came to the cemetery. She always promised herself that she would oil the hinges of that cursed gate since there was no one else to do it. It was a vast, well-maintained cemetery. Every grave was tidy, there was not a single extra weed. Suddenly, a cawing sound filled the air. Eulalia bent down and left a handful of walnuts, which she had specially put in her pocket. Immediately, crows flew in one by one, snatching their walnuts and soaring upward. Soon, each of them would drop the walnut on the pavement until it cracked. Eulalia turned right. She liked this avenue the most. Someday, she would be buried here too, next to her husband. In the vast space enclosed by the fence, there was one more grave, but it was empty. Her husband had decided to bury their daughter in his homeland, despite Eulalia's protests. Now, there was only a plaque here, reminding us that there once was a beautiful girl. "Well, hello," Eulalia whispered softly. She left a large bouquet of pale lilac roses on his grave. He had brought this variety and planted it many years ago. Eulalia was sitting on a long bench, wrapping herself tightly in a warm cardigan and simply looking at her husband's grave. He smiled, gazing into the void. "I messed up, Helio. I tricked our son, even though I promised to stay silent. You know me, I can't keep quiet. He chose that girl, a village idiot. She latched onto him for money, and I have to endure it. Things would have been different if you were here," she said with a heavy heart. Eulalia glanced at her husband's grave one last time. She quickly checked her watch. The elderly woman had been sitting here for 40 minutes without even realizing it. Leaving the cemetery enclosure, she locked the gate. "You no longer visit me in my dreams, Helio. Come to me in my sleep. I'm always happy to see you," Eulalia whispered. "And I will make amends with our son. Say hello to our daughter." Eulalia wiped away a tear and slowly made her way towards the gate. She desperately wanted to look back. She was not a superstitious person, but she wholeheartedly believed that it was bad luck to look back in a cemetery. As she crossed the gate's threshold, she approached her car, opened the trunk, and took out a can with a long nozzle. She lubricated the hinges, turning the door a few times. Soon, the solvent would do its job. Eulalia got into her car and drove home. However, just as she was approaching the house, she decided to change course. On that foggy day, the road was quiet. Cars passed by very rarely. In one of those cars, a luxury automobile, an elderly woman was driving. Eulalia was headed to see her grown son, whom she hadn't seen in a long time. The woman fiddled with the radio, trying to find the right station but failing. She turned off the radio and thought about her son, reflecting on how long it had been since she'd seen him. He was already a grown man. Her neighbor and friend were right, he was old enough to make his own mistakes. The road was shrouded in dense fog, forcing her to drive slowly and carefully, but she wasn't afraid. Since her husband's passing, which was a long time ago, she has had to learn to drive herself. She remembered the time she spent with her son, walking in the park and riding bicycles. She remembered his laughter and his smile, and it made her sad. She made a turn, and now the silhouette of the city was visible in the distance. There was nothing cheerful about this silhouette. Skyscrapers, shop lights, and typical houses marked the beginning of the residential area. She still couldn't comprehend how her son had managed to adapt to city life after so many years of living on the estate. She wouldn't trade her beloved estate for anything. Her main goal now was to persuade her son to move back. She hadn't even warned him that she would be coming today, knowing in advance that her son would be upset. Eulalia turned to the turn, then to the right, followed by another left, and ended up near a high-rise building. She braked, got out of the car, and she immediately could smell gasoline in the air. She had grown completely unaccustomed to this dense smog, referred to here as air. "Mom," Roberto said in surprise. He was sitting on the balcony and immediately jumped to his feet upon seeing her. He rushed into the apartment. As soon as Eulalia pressed 2 buttons on the intercom, it immediately buzzed. She entered the building, then pressed the button in the elevator, and within a few seconds, she was standing in front of her son's apartment. "What a surprise," Roberto said, scratching his head. "I've come to apologize to you and to Christina," she said. "Christina went to get some tests done." "Come on in, and we'll have breakfast together," he said. "Is she unwell?" the woman asked. "She gets a checkup every year." "Nothing serious," Roberto dismissed. They were sitting at the table and talking. Roberto mentioned how it would be great to have the wedding in a marquee. He looked pleased. Eulalia saw that her trap had been set correctly. He fell for the marquee, the dress, and the idea that his mother would foot the bill for all these extravagances. When the door clicked shut, Roberto got up and went to greet his wife. There was a conversation happening that couldn't be heard from the kitchen. The young woman politely greeted Eulalia. "Christina, I've come to apologize. I've behaved terrible, and I understand that. I've told you both how things really are. Think of this as my apology to you. So, don't worry, I'll pay for the wedding, the tent, the catering, and the service. You'll have a wedding to remember for the rest of your lives," Eulalia said. "You came to try to convince us to move to the estate, didn't you?" Christina said in a monotonous tone. "Come on, don't be like that," Roberto said, immediately staring at his mother. "She's right, Roberto. I really came to persuade you both to finally return to the family estate. There's plenty of room there, the air is different, and you need to prepare for the wedding on site. How much time do you have left? A couple of weeks? There's no point in dragging your feet. You should go and get things done." The elderly woman fell silent. She clearly knew she had touched the right chords. All that was left was to give them some time to think. Roberto looked at Christina as if he expected a positive response from her. "Yes, we'll come," Roberto said, deciding to take matters into his own hands. Christina nodded, understanding that no one was waiting for her decision. She quietly left the room, unable to hold back her tears. Eulalia wanted to say something but held her tongue. Christina, the elderly woman, said loudly so the young woman could hear, "Don't be too upset. It's not like it's a prison. If you don't like it there, you can always go back. What's the problem? You can have the wedding, and afterward, you can decide whether to stay in the house or not. Of course, I'll be happy if you stay, but I won't force you to stay against your will." She got up. The elderly woman straightened her dress and walked towards the exit. She spoke with her son outside by the car. Christina watched them from the window, but their conversation couldn't be heard. Roberto nodded, saying something to his mother. She nodded meekly but said very little. Soon, her car disappeared. When Roberto re-entered the apartment, he immediately approached his future wife. "You've made all the decisions without me," Christina calmly stated. However, despite her attempt to appear calm, irritation and disappointment were evident in her voice. "When we started living together in this apartment, I told you right away that we'd be moving. Listen, I understand everything, but I grew up on that estate, and I want to live there. I want my family to be there. I want my children to grow up there. If you can't get along with my mother, Christina, I don't know. Maybe you shouldn't just blame others?" Roberto said as he walked into the kitchen. He realized he had said too much, but he chose not to apologize. He didn't like it when she got upset over trivial matters. To him, these were indeed trivial matters. In just a few days, they packed their things and loaded them into the car. They didn't have many belongings between the two of them. There was enough space in the trunk, and a couple of suitcases were thrown onto the back seat. Roberto looked absolutely happy about returning home. However, Christina was still upset. It felt like this situation had strained their relationship. But she tried to behave the same way as before. The road to the estate was quite good. There was no notorious fog or a significant number of cars. Black fields flanked both sides of the dark road, creating an eerie landscape. Someday, they would turn green, or perhaps even yellow, with wheat stalks. For now, there was just blackness stretching for many meters on either side of the road. You need to accept everything as a fact and make peace with it. You're going to live on a large estate. You'll have a big house. Instead of simply being happy, I won't even mention gratitude. You're giving me the silent treatment like a preschooler, Roberto said with annoyance in his voice when the silhouettes of a cottage settlement appeared ahead. Do I need to bow at your feet? We talked about it, and you yourself didn't know if we'd move. You said we could stay in the city as our own family. Your mother can't stand me. She'll eat me alive over these weeks, Christina said. Don't talk nonsense. I told you about the city so you wouldn't pester me. We don't have another choice. We're going to live on the estate. Do whatever you want to find ways to make amends with my mother. If she were a nasty old lady, I'd understand you. So, you had one conflict with her. What now? Are you going to avoid her? He asked, shrugging. It's time to grow up, Christina. Roberto felt like a fool. Instead of apologizing for his behavior, he was only making the situation worse. The car finally pulled up to the estate. But this time, they didn't stop by the gates. The gates opened, and Roberto drove the car first into the courtyard and then into the garage. He felt tired, although the journey was relatively easy. He moved their things into the house, and by the time Christina had just stepped out of the car, Eulalia greeted them in good spirits, but Christina knew that sooner or later a conflict would arise. However, neither a day nor two went by without any such incident. Wedding preparations were in full swing. Living in the same house turned out to not be as difficult as Christina had imagined. But most of all, the girl liked the fact that her fiancé was absolutely happy to live on his estate once again. However, Eulalia felt that the pent-up irritation would soon come to the surface. She saw how the girl repeatedly hid her phone. Thinking that she might overhear some private conversation, Eulalia sneaked into the room where the young couple lived and concealed herself there. The elderly woman sat in the closet for nearly half an hour, and her legs were starting to cramp. Eulalia was about to leave when the bride-to-be entered the room. The sight that met her left her in shock, and her heart pounded so violently in her chest that it felt like it might burst through. The girl's body was covered in scars, as if enormous, vivid pictures were playing out before Eulalia's mind's eye. Was it a dreadful accident or fire, perhaps? When Eulalia first saw Christina's eyes, she seemed strangely familiar, with those huge brown eyes and a tiny mole just above her brow. Christina let go of her phone, started undressing, and reached for a towel to head into the bathroom. When Eulalia saw her body, her mouth fell open in shock. Her heart ached so strongly that it felt like it might break her ribcage. 15 years ago, they were returning in a car with her husband and son when they got into an accident. Everything happened so fast. Another car's driver came straight at them and collided with Eulalia's husband's car head-on. Her husband swerved to avoid the collision, but it still tore off nearly the entire right side bumper. However, the car that followed them ended up taking the brunt of it. The car caught fire, the one that had driven onto the wrong side of the road. Eulalia was thrown from the car when she saw that the driver had died, but the little girl on the back seat, those big brown eyes, the tiny mole right above her brow. Eulalia's husband yelled at her to get back in the car, and she, scared and hearing the wailing sirens of the ambulance or fire brigade somewhere nearby, jumped into the car. They sped off, leaving everything unchanged. It was the same girl who had been in the car. The very same one. Eulalia leaned forward slightly, and the tightening in her chest gradually subsided. The tension in her legs was dissipating. She needed to speak to someone urgently before things spiraled out of control. Eulalia rushed out of the room and almost immediately ran into her son. "Why are you in our bedroom?" Roberto asked without any hint of suspicion in his voice. "A mouse just ran under your door to your room. I thought I could catch the little troublemaker." It's been running around for 3 days now, and here it is again. I'm going to the neighbor. Maybe she has poison. Don't tell Christina. It's embarrassing. Such a large house, and yet we have a mouse, Eulalia lied on the spot as she was walking out of the room. She hurriedly left the house and made her way towards Maria's mansion. As soon as her neighbor welcomed her, she led her inside. In the center of the mansion, there was a luxurious, modern living room in Rococo style, belonging to the elderly hostess, who had a refined taste and a love for details. The living room's interior was astonishing in its opulence and elegance. Every detail had been meticulously thought out and crafted with special attention to quality and style. The walls of the living room were adorned with elegant silk wallpapers with golden ornamentation, giving the room an atmosphere of wealth and luxury. In the center of the room, there was a lavish velvet-upholstered couch adorned with golden embroidery and silk pillows. The elderly hostess of the living room, dressed in an elegant gown, sat on the couch, admiring her beloved paintings that adorned the walls of the living room. She took pride in creating an interior that reflected her character and taste, earning the admiration of many of her guests. The fireplace, constructed from natural marble and embellished with gold, especially drew attention to itself. Above the fireplace, there was a painting depicting the hostess of the living room in her youth, emphasizing her love for art and her family's history. Every piece of furniture in this living room was crafted from precious wood, adorned with exquisite carvings, and inlaid with precious gemstones. Eulalia quickly recounted everything to Maria. She burst into tears as her emotions overwhelmed her. Maria summoned a housekeeper, who promptly brought them coffee and homemade cookies. Maria took one coconut cookie, dipped it in her coffee, and took a bite. She wasn't thinking straight if she didn't eat breakfast. And are you planning to keep all of this hidden? You realize that sooner or later, all secrets will come to light, my dear. And if they find out later that you were aware but didn't tell them, do you think it will strengthen your relationship with your son? Maria asked. Why are you always nagging at me, like a kitten in a litter box? Eulalia protested. Maria burst into laughter, throwing her head back. Her laughter had a delightful, tinkling quality to it. Unintentionally, Eulalia found herself smiling. She suddenly remembered how they were sitting in this living room when they were much younger, laughing and discussing their future husbands. And now her own son was getting married. Maria's own sons had been married for quite some time and visited only to delight their mother with grandchildren. But how can I do this now? She'll find out, make a scene, and then they'll leave me alone, Eulalia said, waving her hands in frustration. Maria shook her head disapprovingly. She gazed at her friend and then moved to the couch beside her. You're better off telling them yourself rather than everything coming out later. Trust me, it'll be harder to mend the relationship if they find out that you concealed all this for so long. You need to be a bit more open with both of them. Listen, Maria paused, bit her lip, and then took a deep breath before she continued, you have an incredibly understanding son. The only thing you need to do is be honest with him. Yes, it's tough to watch your children grow up and make their own decisions, and sometimes it's difficult to see them make mistakes and not want to prevent them. But you have to accept everything as it is. Talk to your son and his fiancée. If necessary, I'll talk to them myself and try to smooth things over a bit, she said, gently patting her friend's hand. Eulalia spent about an hour at her friend's house. She loved this house for its antique interior, which was treated with such care. She loved being here, even when she was in a bad mood. There was always the scent of expensive leather, some silk, and an oriental fragrance in the air. Eulalia left her neighbor's and friend's house with a completely different state of mind. She knew that if she didn't confess now, she'd never find the strength to do it. She was walking along the long, wide street, occasionally glancing at various cottages and mansions. She loved living here. This was her whole life. She was born here, raised her own children, and this is where they would raise her grandchildren. Tears streamed down her face because Eulalia was sure that this conversation would ruin all her attempts to reconcile. How could she have treated that poor girl so badly? The girl had nearly died just because Eulalia, along with her husband and son, had driven away. They were so frightened and then so disappointed with their own actions, but nothing could be changed. "Mom, you look upset," her son said as he stepped outside. He had an axe slung over his shoulder, held tightly in his right hand. The heavy, antique axe was still sharp and could probably cut a horsehair in half. "Son, I need to talk to you," she said. "Let's talk over lunch in a couple of hours." A tree fell on Basilio's property, nearly wrecking his car. "We'll have to pull it out quickly with the help of a few friends, or the weather will turn bad." "Can't this wait?" "I'll be back as soon as I can," her son said. "Son, did you see her body is covered with scars?" his mother asked suddenly. "Yeah, it doesn't bother me much. She's already talked to some doctors there. She wants to get them removed. There are all these new treatments now. I don't know much about it." "All right, Mom, I need to go. I'm swamped with work," he said. He kissed his mother on the forehead and then, quickly descending the steps, disappeared behind the gates. Eulalia walked into the kitchen. Christina was already bustling around. "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm here," the girl said nervously, quickly tidying up. "Don't worry. Everything's fine, Christina." Eulalia paused. What should she have done? Should she have confessed everything to her without her son? Eulalia couldn't take it and burst into tears. She told Christina everything that was now weighing on her heart. The elderly woman expected Christina to lash out, scream, and accuse her. When her son entered, it seemed he had come back for some reason. He found this strange scene. Christina was sitting next to his mother, and his mother was sobbing uncontrollably. Christina softly recounted the situation to her future husband. Suddenly, he, too, remembered the accident and was horrified. Those eyes, the mole above her brow, the scars from burns, it all seemed to be in a haze now. "Don't be upset. I recognized you right away. I don't hold any grudges against you, really. We were rescued almost immediately. It didn't even take a few minutes. And if you had stayed, who knows, the fire might have spread to your car. My uncle, who was driving, was drunk. He caused the accident. It's his fault," Christina repeated quietly, over and over again. When they were alone, their conversation was long and thorough. They discussed many things, and Eulalia noticed how her attitude towards this girl had suddenly changed. She was genuinely kind, caring, and affectionate. She had no intention of enriching herself through her son. Deciding to change the situation a bit, Christina suggested preparing something together. She had already sliced some beef to simmer in sauce and then complemented it with mashed potatoes. Soon, laughter filled the kitchen. And when Roberto returned to the estate in the evening, he could feel that the atmosphere had changed. "It's nice to see you two together," he said. When he entered, Christina was sitting on the couch, holding knitting needles. She was working on another baby sock, which she loved so much. His mother was sitting on the couch as well, trying to follow along. Roberto knew that his mother was excellent at crocheting, but knitting had always been challenging for her. "Let's go have dinner now, they've been waiting for you." "Go take a shower," his mother said with a smile. She was counting stitches again, her eyes focused on the needles. Roberto felt a weight lift off his shoulders. Finally, reconciliation would reign in the house, and Christina could finally get used to staying here. He felt so relieved. They had dinner together as one big family, laughing, and everything was good. A few days later, when the marquee was being set up, Eulalia supervised the process. Workers were assembling the enormous structure. "Make sure to secure it on the right side and on this side as well," Eulalia insisted. "Why?" "There's no wind in the weather forecast," one of the workers said. "Do I pay you for the weather forecast?" "If I say it needs to be secured, it means it needs to be secured," Eulalia replied firmly. She turned and saw the woman in charge of the decor carrying a huge pile of semi-transparent fabric. She would use this to cover the entire ceiling of the tent to add an airy feel. Even now, the entire structure looked remarkably beautiful. Neighbors passing by would stop and inquire about what was happening. Everyone was looking forward to the wedding and was eager to see what the tent would be like. "What about the flowers?" Eulalia asked in amazement. "They will be delivered on the wedding day." "Fresh ones," the woman said. "And yes, I remember that your garden should have a bouquet on the presidium." "I remember everything, Eulalia, everything." Work was in full swing. Eulalia oversaw the process but would occasionally step inside the house. Christina remained outside, watching her fairy tale come to life. She truly didn't hold a grudge against Eulalia. Not only had a weight lifted from Roberto's heart, but also from Christina's when their relationship finally improved. The wedding day came. To say that Christina was nervous would be an understatement. The photographer was practically dancing around her, taking one shot after another. The makeup artist had completed her makeup and was now working on her hair. Her magnificent dress hung on long hangers. Nearby was a cheerful dress, which she would change into later in the evening. It was simpler, less elaborate, but no less luxurious. Eulalia knocked on the door and then peeked inside. "How much longer?" she asked. "The guests are starting to gather. The ceremony is scheduled to begin in half an hour. Will you make it?" "We'll be done in 15 to 20 minutes, no later," the young woman said, pointing to the hairstyle. "Okay, no problem. If anything, I'm here." "They can wait, they won't go anywhere," Eulalia said with a wide smile. Christina was nervous. It was finally the wedding day. But she didn't expect everything to be perfect. The most important thing was that they were together and happy. The dresses concealed her burns. After the wedding, once she received permission for the operation, they would gradually remove the scars through procedures and plastic surgery. She took a deep breath and finally stood up from the small table with a large mirror. She felt like the most beautiful bride. When she was walking down the aisle, which was a magnificent arch covered in pure white roses, her husband became emotional. They had signed their marriage papers 4 days earlier. Now it was time for the outdoor ceremony. He gazed at her with admiration, just like all the guests. When the couple exchanged their vows, many guests were in tears. It was so touching and sweet. The wedding in the tent was truly a magnificent spectacle. All the guests were dressed in their finest attire, and the atmosphere was filled with joy and celebration. A lavish wedding banquet featured a variety of dishes, and every guest could find something to their liking. The newlyweds looked stunning in their wedding attire, and all the guests congratulated them on this beautiful occasion. The atmosphere was so pleasant that all the guests felt comfortable and joyful. The wedding tent was adorned with flowers and ribbons, creating a sense of festivity and joy. Guests danced to music, played games, and enjoyed each other's company. The wedding tent became an unforgettable event for all those present, and they would cherish this beautiful day for a long time. "Well, you've grown up so fast," said a neighbor, raising his glass. "May everything be good for you. You're still young, and you don't understand, but the most important thing is to have good health. Everything else will fall into place, and I swear it will. I wish you had children and lived happily together. And that's all you need." All the guests cheered and raised their glasses, and another toast was heard. The newlyweds were absolutely delighted on this day. As the evening approached, warm lights were turned on, and a different kind of music was playing. Hot dishes were served, and everyone sat down at the tables again. Everything was calm and peaceful until the next round of games began. The wedding was both long and joyful. Then, in royal fashion, a magnificent white cake adorned with elegant chocolate roses was brought out. The guests applauded joyfully. After having a coffee, everyone finally started to head home. The guests were quite tired, but it was a pleasant fatigue. They approached the newlyweds, left their final congratulations, and departed in their cars or to their homes. The cottage community would remember the beautiful, fairy tale wedding in the marquee for a long time. "I was so against you two being together when you first came here. I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, but I'm truly very happy that you're together. I've seen that you've become a completely different person, Christina. I hope you'll be genuinely happy, Eulalia said. I don't hold any grudges against you. These things happen. Sometimes personalities clash, Christina replied. Does that mean you'll stay here? Eulalia asked with hope in her voice. Yes, we'll stay at the estate. Eulalia jumped up and clapped her hands. Waitstaff were already clearing the tables. Several large minibuses pulled up to pick up the entire staff. The tent would be taken down tomorrow, and once again, the area would be just a spacious green lawn. In a few months, the grass would turn yellow, and then, a few months later, it would be covered in a blanket of snow. For now, warm summer days and cool evenings prevailed. Christina took a shower as soon as she took off her dress. She closed her eyes, standing under the hot shower, feeling how tired her body was. She would remember this wedding forever. Now it was time to truly relax. Christina entered the bedroom. The modern, spacious bedroom was decorated in shades of green, creating an atmosphere of calm and comfort. One of the walls was painted in a dark graphite shade, adding contrast and making the room more stylish. This wall featured living moss in a frame, adding a special charm to the bedroom. The furniture in the bedroom was made of natural materials, such as wood and stone. The bed was large and soft, with a green duvet and plenty of pillows. Next to the bed was a wooden dresser with a mirror, where various accessories and jewelry were displayed. A soft rug with an abstract pattern lay on the floor, adding to the room's coziness and comfort. The windows were large and bright, with green curtains that could be drawn for a more intimate atmosphere. The bedroom was equipped with modern amenities such as air conditioning, a television, and a music center. There was also a small reading nook in the room, with a comfortable sofa and a table with books and magazines. One of the main highlights of the bedroom was the wall with living moss. It not only added uniqueness but also created a pleasant microclimate in the room. Her husband was already lying on the bed. She lay down beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. Her legs were sore, but they both smiled, despite being exhausted. "What a wedding!" he exclaimed. "Honestly, I had doubts about the tent until the very end, but it was so beautiful. No restaurant could even compare. I'm so glad that everything happened this way. I'm ashamed of how I treated you back then. We had a fight because of it. I didn't want to come, like a little child," Christina said, her tone filled with embarrassment. "I was a fool too, pushing you away, unable to compromise. I should have talked to you properly instead of waiting for you to understand everything telepathically. Everything will be fine for us, Christina. I'm glad we've overcome all this. I'm also glad we'll be able to live here together. I love this place so much. To be honest, I worried until the very last moment that you might change your mind," he said. Christina nodded. She felt ashamed that her uncertainty and worries had made her husband nervous. They began to talk about their upcoming trip. They were planning to fly to another country to celebrate their honeymoon. And then, upon their return, they would start thinking about children. After packing their suitcases, they left. Despite Eulalia being left in complete solitude, she no longer felt as lonely as before. She knew that her children would return soon, and within a few weeks, the house would once again be filled with voices, laughter, and conversations. She was still ashamed of her past behavior, but she tried to forgive herself. Maria sat on the same veranda as before. However, if their conversation had been tense and complicated on that occasion, now an atmosphere of coziness prevailed. "You were so afraid they wouldn't get together, and look how everything turned out. That's how life is. You never know how the Lord will arrange things," her neighbor said, smiling significantly. "I'm ready to pray for her now. She's such a wonderful girl, honestly. I'm ashamed of how I treated her back then, and I even kicked them both out with my behavior. I'm lucky she forgave me. I couldn't make amends with my husband's mother back then, and, by God, I almost put this young girl in the same situation," Eulalia said. Maria clearly wanted to talk about something. Her gaze was restless, and there was a strange sense of tension. She pushed her cup aside and then looked at her friend. Her tone sounded conspiratorial. Isn't it strange? If you think about it, this girl in the car, the fire, and then fate brings them together. Why do you think it happened that way? What is it that the heavens want to show us? Maybe they want to show that even after such tragic twists of fate, people can find each other again. I've been thinking about that a lot myself. You know, I believe that people are destined for each other. And maybe they're destined for each other, too. Every time I look at them, my heart aches. It reminds me of how my husband and I used to be. It's been so many years since he passed away, but I still miss him, as if he's about to come back, Eulalia said. It's a good thing it all worked out this way. Don't worry, everything will be fine. Imagine all of you celebrating New Year's by the fireplace. And when they have kids, you won't have time to think about such nonsense. Maria exclaimed, laughing. They were chatting, drinking coffee, and simply enjoying the atmosphere. Eulalia knew that their destinies were intertwined as tightly as Roberto's and Christina's. Deep within the estate, among dense thickets and tall trees, there was a small pond. The water in it was clear and transparent, with the banks adorned by beautiful flowers and shrubs. A gazebo was located next to the pond, providing shelter from the scorching sun or rain. Various fish were swimming in the pond. For the winter, a special service took them to prevent them from freezing, and in the warm seasons, they were returned. Eulalia loved to sit by the pond, but now she was not alone. She held a charming blonde girl in her arms, who giggled while listening to her grandmother's words. The well-off elderly woman, dressed in an elegant summer dress, held her 1-year-old granddaughter in her arms. The grandmother smiled and gently stroked the little girl's head. The baby laughed, grabbing her by the long locks. In the grandmother's eyes, there was happiness and love for her little granddaughter. "Grandma!" the little girl exclaimed. "Grandmother," Eulalia repeated and laughed. Christina watched from the sidelines. This scene reminded her of how important it is to maintain the connection between generations and pass on love and care to children and grandchildren. In such moments, we feel genuine happiness and the joy of life. When she learned of her pregnancy, she was so frightened because she had no idea how to interact with children. But now, she couldn't imagine her life without this little girl. She would soon turn 1 year old, and they would have a celebration. Christina admired the idealistic picture from the sidelines. Her husband approached her and sat down beside her. "I think she even became younger when our daughter was born. Maybe it will become easier for her, at least a bit, to forget Fernanda," he said, remembering his deceased sister. "It's unlikely that something like that can be forgotten, Roberto, but I'm glad she enjoys it so much. She spends much more time with our granddaughter than we expected. So maybe she's right. We better start planning for the second one while we have time." "Imagine a boy and a girl, a complete set," Christina said joyfully. She smiled. Christina involuntarily placed her hand on her belly. "I haven't told you, but I was so scared when I found out I was pregnant. I was afraid that my life would change irreversibly. But you know what actually changed? My life became much deeper and happier. I found meaning, motivation, and true happiness. I've never experienced such love in my life as I have for our daughter. I wouldn't trade it for anything else in the world." He hugged his wife. The little girl turned and now reached her arms out to her parents. They both were standing in unison, walked over to her, and joined her in the gazebo by the pond. There was everyone. They laughed, discussed their future plans, and simply enjoyed spending time together. Christina looked at her family, feeling like she belonged to them. And she also felt happiness, the real kind that can't be bought with any amount of money.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.